The next Sifaat that we're going to discuss go hand in hand, which is full mouth and empty mouth letters. Full mouth is called tafkhim and empty mouth is called tarqiq. So I did discuss it in the makharij section, but if we haven't watched it or if we forgot, I'm going to reiterate it. What happens with a full mouth letter is that the back of the tongue controls the pitch of the sound as it's coming out of the mouth. And basically how sound works, as many of us may know, sound is a wave, right? So let's pretend this is your mouth, and on the floor of your mouth you have your tongue. And now obviously the sound is coming out from your voice box. Air is produced by your lungs, comes out of your throat, and eventually makes its way out of your mouth or out of your nose. So when air comes out of here, out of your lungs, it is converted by the larynx into sound, and sound is a wave. So your wave will look like this here. It goes up and down, right? And your wave makes its way out of the oral cavity. Now, if you know anything about mathematics, sine graphs, you'll know that the amplitude of a sine graph, which is the height of this wave right here, corresponds to the pitch of the sound, right? So the higher the amplitude of this wave, meaning if your wave looks bigger like this here, it means that this sound has a higher pitch, and a sound like this would have a lower pitch because the amplitude of the wave is lower. So a higher pitch of sound is more closely related to an empty mouth letter, and a lower pitch of sound is more closely related to a full mouth letter. Okay, so now how does this affect the way that we pronounce things? Now look at this back of the tongue portion here. If you can see in this diagram currently, the back of the tongue is down against the floor of the mouth, right? It's not raised up. So that means that the wave is free to move in whatever shape that it wants to, right? So it's free to move with a bit of a larger amplitude as it comes out of the mouth. This will create a higher pitched sound, which is more closely related to empty mouth letters. So when the back of the tongue is down, it will always create an empty mouth letter when the pronunciation is made. Now the opposite is also true. If you take a look at this back of the tongue, right? I'm going to change the diagram a little bit. Now if your tongue was raised towards the back, like this here, what would it mean for the sound coming out of your mouth? So the sound waves, as you can see, are now forced to move in a smaller space, so that when they do come out of your mouth, two things happen. The first thing is that you have a smaller amplitude, so a lower pitch of sound. And the second thing is, can you see the eminence of the sound is more towards the upper lip, right? So when the sound comes out of your mouth, you're going to feel the eminence of it on your upper lip. And lower pitch sounds are more closely related to full mouth letters. So what did we learn from this? We learned that for full mouth letters, your tongue, the back of the tongue is up. Back of the tongue is up. Also, you have a lower pitch of sound. And the final thing is that the eminence of the sound is more prominent on the upper jaw. And then for an empty sound, we said that the back of the tongue is down. It has a higher pitch, and you feel it more on the lower jaw. So you can test this out. If you say words like wa, fa, ma, ba, all of those words, they are empty letters, right? Under every circumstance, they are empty letters. So when you pronounce these letters, the back of your tongue is all the way down. It's in a relaxed position. And you can hear that the eminence of these letters, when it comes out of your mouth, ma, ba, fa, you feel it more on the bottom jaw than you do on the top jaw, right? Now juxtapose these to letters like to, letters like qaf, letters like ha. All of these letters are pronounced while rising the back of the tongue up. It's basically just a re-explanation of the Sifaat isti'la, which we did in the previous lesson, right? But I needed to emphasize this concept because now we're going to deal with letters that are full mouth in some circumstances and empty mouth in other circumstances, right? So the first letter that we're going to deal with, the easier one, is going to be the letter lam. Right? Now the lam is empty in every circumstance besides one. So the only time you'll ever pronounce a lam with a full mouth is in the word Allahu. Right? So if it's Allah at the beginning of a sentence, or if the word Allah is preceded by either a fatha, so you can say mallaha, or mullahi, right? If it's preceded by a fatha or dhamma, it will be pronounced with a full mouth, and if it is preceded by a kasra, it will be pronounced with the empty mouth, right? So millahi. So under no other circumstances is lam to be pronounced with a full mouth, especially when it is followed by a full mouth letter. So a very common mistake is the word sultan. Right, you've got sultan. Now you can see the lam is followed by a ta. What happens when we pronounce ta? The back of our tongue goes up because it's a full mouth letter. Now we must be very careful not to put the back of the tongue up during the pronunciation of lam, because then we sound like sultan, like a full mouth lam, right? But we need to remember that lam under no circumstances besides the one that I just explained is it to be read with a full mouth. So sultan. Make sure that you give the lam its due diligence of being tarqiq, empty, and then you only lift up the back of your tongue to pronounce the ta with a full mouth. Sultan. Right? Another example, two separate words this time. Bal taba'a. Right? It's bal taba'a Allahu alayha, but I'm just going to write bal taba'a. So you can see now we've got lam followed by a ta again in two separate words. Bal taba'a Allahu. Bal taba'a Allahu. Obviously during recitation you're not going to stop here in between these two words, but you are going to press just a little bit longer on the lam so as to not make it a full mouth while you're busy sorting out the back of your tongue for the ta that comes right after it. The next letter that we discuss the fullness and emptiness of is going to be the letter ra. Now ra can either be mutaharrik, which means with the haraka. It can be sakin with a sukun, or it can be mushadda with a tashdid. So under each of these circumstances there are different rules. So let's do ra mutaharrik first because it's the easiest. So if a ra has a fatha or a dhamma, it will be pronounced full mouth. If a ra has a kasra, it will be pronounced empty mouth. Right? As simple as that. So this is the first state in which you can find this ra. So for example, the word rabbu. Ra, full mouth because with the fatha. Rabbu. Another example with a dhamma can be rubama. Rubama, full mouth as well. Right? Now if you look at ra with a kasra, it's going to be read empty. So rijal. Rijal. So you can compare ra versus ri. Rabbu, rijal, two different pronunciations, and it's all to do with the back of the tongue. Now rule number 2 is when you have a ra mushadda with a tashdid. So ra mushadda has the same ruling as ra with a haraka. So if ra is tashdid and has a fatha, it will be pronounced full mouth regardless of what came before or after it. The same goes for ra with a dhamma, and the same goes for ra with a kasra. It will be pronounced empty mouth regardless of what came before or after it. So a common mistake is min sharri. You've got your sheen and your ra. Now people get confused because there's a fatha before, then they pronounce it sharri, right? But in actual fact, because the ra has a tashdid, it takes on the same ruling as ra with a normal haraka. So you will join empty and you will read empty as well, right? So you will read min sharri, min sharri. You notice that when joining to the letter it's empty, and when releasing the haraka it will be empty. And the same is true for the opposite, right? So if you have a traditionally empty word before the ra and you have a ra that is mutaharrik and has a fatha, for example, right? So the word birra. So we've got B, which is an empty mouth and it's a kasra. So you may get confused and say, okay, there's a kasra before, so now I need to read this with the empty mouth. But in actual fact, it is mutaharrik, it has a fatha, so it takes on the same ruling as a normal haraka. Ra with a fatha is under all circumstances to be read with a full mouth. So we're joining full and we're releasing the haraka full. So birra, birra. Okay? And the same can be said for ra mutaharrik with a dhamma. Okay, now the third rule is when you have a ra with a sakin, right? So either written like this here or written like this here in some books. So a ra with a sakin now is dependent on the letter before it. Okay, so if you have a ra with a sakin that is preceded by either a fatha or a dhamma, right? So you have mu or ma before this ra with a sakin. Let's ignore this for a second. This ra will be pronounced under all circumstances as full. So if you have a fatha before, ma, mar, mu, mur, you can hear that is full, right? Now ra sakin that is preceded by a kasra, here's a few other rules, right? So if we have I and a ra, it will be pronounced. Okay, so a circumstance like this here has three conditions to it. So if you have a ra with a sakin that is preceded by a kasra, it will be read empty mouth provided that it satisfies these three conditions. The first condition is that the kasra needs to be permanent. Okay, and I'm going to explain what permanent means in a second. The second is that the ra sakin must not be followed by a letter of isti'la. So no full mouth letter after. And the third condition is that the kasra and the ra must be within the same word. So same word. Okay, so I'm just going to erase the top here and we can discuss this further. Now take a word like fir'aun, for example. Fir'aun. Fir'aun is a single word because it's somebody's name, right? So it satisfies the first, well, the last condition already, right? So we have a ra with a sakin preceded by a kasra. So now we have to look for these three conditions. The second one we see, is there a full mouth letter after the ra? No, ayn is not a full mouth letter. So we can tick that off. Is the kasra permanent? Is it written inside the Quran? So a permanent kasra is one that is physically written in the Quran. You can see that they've put a kasra in there and it doesn't depend on the previous letters. Now for certain words, especially in the beginning of ayat and certain command words, some of them, if you continue from the previous ayah and you join, the haraka may change. So you'll notice, for example, in Surah Yasin, most people know, وَجَاءَ مِنْ أَقْصَى الْمَدِينَةِ رَجُلُ يَسْعَى قَالَ يَا قَوْمِ اتَّبِعُوا الْمُرْسَلِينَ اتَّبِعُوا مَنْ لَا يَسْأَلُكُمْ. اتَّبِعُوا is a command word, right? Now if you go in your Quran and you look at that ayah, اتَّبِعُوا, you'll notice that there's no haraka on the alif. It's a hamzat al-wasl, which means that fatha, dhamma, or kasra can be read from there depending on whether you're continuing from the previous ayah or if you're going to stop and you're going to carry on fresh from ittabi'u, right? So even in Surah Al-Fajr you have Ya ayyatuha nafsul mutma'inna irji'i, another command word, and you can go in the Quran and you see it's not written in there, the alif, the haraka on the alif is not written in there. So in a situation like that you have, I'll just throw it out for you, irji'i, right? You'll notice in the Quran it doesn't have this on top of it, right? So it's just a alif and then it's got your hamzat al-wasl sign there. So we go in the Quran, we normally write this in here so we don't forget that it's a irji'i. But in a case like this here, this is a non-permanent kasra, because if you were to continue from the previous ayah, it would be Ya ayyatuha nafsul mutma'inna turji'i, right? Because you're going to read that ta, mutma'innatu, irji'i, mutma'inna turji'i. Because this kasra is not permanent and this word can be changed, the haraka of this alif can be changed depending on what comes before it, then this ra in this case will be read with a full mouth, right? but we'll come to that in a second. So in the word Fir'aun, this is obviously not taking place because we have the person's name, right? And it's not dependent on what came before it, and it's a physical kasra that is written in the Quran, so you can see it. It's there, it's permanent. So we can tick that off. So therefore, because this ra meets all three of these conditions, permanent kasra before it, within the same word, and there's no full mouth letter afterwards, this ra will be pronounced empty mouth. Fir'aun. Now, if you take a look at another example, here we've got liman and irtada, two separate words, right? So let's look at how we would pronounce this ra. So the first thing we look for is the kasra permanent. It's written in, not dependent on the previous letter. So the kasra is permanent, we can tick it off. Is there a full mouth letter immediately after the ra? Nope. We are following it up with a ta. Ta is a flat letter, so we all good here. We can tick this off. The third and final condition, is it within the same word? Now you can see liman is one word and irtada is another word. So the third and final condition is not met, so therefore this ra will not be pronounced with the empty mouth, it will be pronounced with the full mouth. So you would read this ayah, إِلَّا لِمَنِ ارْتَضَى. So you're going to join in a full mouth manner. The final way that we can pronounce it, or the final way in which we can break one of these conditions, is that if your ra sakin is followed by a full mouth, right? So in Surah An-Naba we've got mirsada, and in this case we can see that it's a single word, right? So this particular category is fulfilled. The kasra is permanent because it's written in and there's nothing that comes before it that can determine the haraka on the meme. But now there's a letter of isti'la afterwards, right? So there's a sad, which is a full mouth letter, immediately after the ra. So this condition has not been met, so therefore this ra will not be read empty mouth, it will be read full, right? So Inna jahannama kanat mirsada. So you're going to join full. Another potential rule that you can have is when you have a ra with a sakin, due to stopping on it or the ra being at the end of a ayah. So usually when a ra is mutaharrik and you stop on it, when any letter is mutaharrik and you stop on it, you put a sakin. So if a ra is at the end of a ayah and is not necessarily sakin, but because you're stopping at the end of the ayah, you're putting a sakin, this is known as sakin arid, then there are a few rules to do with this, very similar to the rules of ra sakin itself within a word. But there are one or two exceptions, right? So the first one is, obviously whenever ra sakin is preceded by fatha or dhamma, it will be pronounced with a full mouth. So if you're ending an ayah with the word nuzur, for example, nun dha ra, so it's nuzuri. But because you're ending, this is the end of an ayah, so you're going to stop here, so this is going to become sakin due to the stopping. So this will be pronounced with a full mouth due to the dhamma preceding it. So it will be nudhur, nudhur. Pay careful attention that the dhal is still flat. Nudhur. And you can notice a similar trend with the word matari. So you've got matari, and because you're stopping, the ra gets a sakin, and preceding the ra is a fatha. So because the ra is preceded by a fatha, it will be pronounced with a full mouth. So this will be matar if we are stopping. So this is for fatha and for dhamma. And like we discussed previously, whenever ra is preceded by a kasra, it will be empty mouth. So you've got the word asir, which is asirun. But because we're stopping, we cancel this out and we put a sakin. And because it's preceded by a kasra, it will be pronounced with an empty mouth. So this will be pronounced asir, asir. Okay, now some situations we can have where a ra is preceded by a sakin letter, and then if you stop on that ra, it makes it sakin, so you have two sukun next to each other. So this can be seen in a case like wal fajr. You've got wal fajr. So in this case, it's wal fajr, and you're stopping on the ra, so it will get a sakin. Now you can see you have a sakin here, which is the jim, and you got a sakin here, which is the ra. So in this case, you will take the rule of the letter preceding, right? So you will look at the fa because it's the closest available letter that has a haraka, and you will take the rule of the fa. So because the fa has a fatha in this case, then this ra will be pronounced with a full mouth. Now pay very careful attention. The ra will be pronounced with the full mouth, but there is no other letter in this entire word that is a full mouth letter. Waw is flat, lam is flat, fa is flat, and jim is also flat. So this needs to be very carefully pronounced, right? So the ra gets the fullness at the end of the word, but the jim with its qalqala are going to be empty mouth. So this will be pronounced as wal fajr, wal fajr. You can see the ra full only at the end of the ayah. So wal fajr all empty, and then the ra is going to be full. Wal fajr. The first few ayat of Surah Al-Fajr, you can see a similar trend. So wal fajr wa layalin ashr. So we've got ashr here. So you've got a sakin on the sheen, and you've got a sakin on the ra as well. So we take the rule of the letter preceding it, the closest available haraka, and because this is a fatha, then this ra will be pronounced with a full mouth. But the sheen gets an empty mouth because sheen is an empty mouth letter. So you will say walayalin ashr, walayalin ashr. والشفع والوتر, same thing. Waw ta ra, you take the haraka of the waw in the ruling of the ra, right? Now let's look at هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر. ح جيم را. Ra with a sakin preceded by a sakin. So we take the rule of the closest available haraka, which is the ha that has a kasra. So the ha having a kasra makes this ra empty mouth. Right, so this is a very commonly mispronounced word. The ra at the end of this ayah needs to be pronounced with tarqiq, empty mouth. هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر. قسم لذي حجر. There are various other examples, but we won't go into the depths of it today. Now, an exception to this rule, as every rule in Arabic has exceptions, is when you have a ra sakin that is preceded by a ya sakin in any letter, right? So let's say you have the word khabir, khabir, and you have the word khair. So in these two cases, we can see, okay, if we apply the normal ruling to the first one, ra with a sakin, preceded by a sakin, so we take the letter of the previous word, which is a kasra, which means that the ra will be pronounced with the empty mouth, right? So the rule still stands for this one here, because B is the empty mouth, a kasra, so ra will be pronounced with an empty mouth. Khabir, right, which is correct. This ra will be indeed pronounced with an empty mouth. But if you look at the second word, khair, ra with a kasra preceded by a kasra, and the preceding letter, the closest available haraka, is a fatha. So now will we pronounce this with a full mouth? The answer is no. Right? The exception to this rule of ra sakin arid is when it is preceded by a ya sakin. Under any circumstance, it will always be pronounced with an empty mouth, right? With tarqiq. So even if there's a fatha or dhamma before the ya, fatha, there'll never be a dhamma before the ya. Even if there's a fatha before a ya, it will be pronounced with empty mouth, right? So a word like this will be pronounced khair, khair. And you can see because the ya itself leans towards a kasra sound. Yi, khair. It sounds like a kasra. So therefore, to make it easier for us to pronounce, we've made the rule that we pronounce these ra sakinin with tarqiq. Mudud, which is the plural of mad, which means to extend a sound, an open letter. So the first mud that we're going to discuss, if you're using a 13-line Quran, you'll see that some of the muds look like this here, and some of the muds will look like this here. Right, so there'll be some curly ones and some flat straight ones, right? So these are easily distinguishable. Whereas in the 15-line Quran, I think they all look the same, right? So they're all going to be curly. The main thing is to learn the difference between the two and why we pronounce each one differently. So the two main types is mad al-munfasil and mad al-muttasil. Right, so we'll start with muttasil. Muttasil means to be joint, right? To be joint. So it comes from the concept of being in the same word as something else, right? So a mad muttasil is basically when you have an open letter, alif after fatha, or waw after dhamma, or ya after kasra. So a, u, or e sound. And following that sound within the same word, you have a hamza, right? So a very easy example is ja'at, ja'at. This is one word, and within the same word is a hamza that comes after this open letter. So this is called muttasil, or it's pronounced muttasil, like this here, right? Muttasil. So these mudud are the longer ones, right? So you're going to lengthen this mad anywhere between 2 and 4 alifs, right? It is preferred to lengthen the mad 3 alifs, right? But it's also preferred to make a distinction between the shorter mads and the longer mads, right? So I personally would say that if you're going to choose 4 alifs for this one, then choose 3 alifs for the previous one, just so that there's a distinction between the two, right? So anywhere from 2 to 4 is acceptable, but 3 would be preferred for this type of mad. So in a word like this here, you would recite as ja'at. So an alif, for those who don't know, is the duration that it takes to open a closed finger or to close an open finger, right? So you just open your finger at normal pace, and that's how you count one alif. So to open 3 fingers at normal pace, so it will be 1, 2, 3, right? Just a little bit less than 2 seconds, you would lengthen this mad. Now, the second type of mad we have is called mad munfasil, right? Now, munfasil is when you have the same thing, so an open letter followed by an a hamza, but the hamza is in the next word, right? So it's not in the same word. So for example, you've got here la uqsimu, la uqsimu. Now we can see la is one word, right? Here's one word here, and uqsimu is another word. Whereas in this case here, mad muttasil, this was a single word with the hamza coming immediately after the mad. Now you have a break between the two words, and the hamza is forming part of the next word. So in a case like this, you would lengthen also between 2 and 4 alifs. Now there's a lot of difference of opinion amongst the scholars of qira'at as to the duration of all the mudud, right? But to keep it simple, we say, okay, between 2 to 4 alifs for mad munfasil and for mad muttasil is acceptable. Now, according to a certain qira'at, it is permissible to do qasr of this mad, which is called which is shortening of the alif to 1 alif, right? So you'll notice with the Saudi reciters, the imams of the Haramain, when they read the 3 alif mads, they do not pull it at all, right? So they would read this as la uqasimu, and they will only pull the muttasil mads. It is preferred that you pull the mads, right, between 2 and 4 alifs, and basically just make sure you lengthen this one. So this one must be longer and this one must be shorter. So if you're going to make this one 2, make this one 3. If you're going to make this one 3, make this one 4. The next type that we'll discuss is called mad al-lazim. So mad al-lazim is when you have a mad in 3 circumstances. Either you have an open letter that is immediately followed up by a sakin or a tashdid, right? So you have the word al-ana. Al-ana, you can see you got a mad, and immediately after the mad there is a sakin of the lam. The second case we can have is when it's followed by a tashdid. So you can have the word khassa. And then the third case is when you have the starting letters of a surah, like alif lam mim, alif lam ra. kaf, ha, ya, ain, sad, those kind of things, right? So when it's just letters next to each other. So I'll put alif, lam, mim as our example. Alif, lam, mim. Okay. So the first case, when you have an open letter that is followed up by a sakin, you will lengthen that open letter to 5 alifs, right? The second and third is also both 5 alifs, and all of these fall under the category of mad al-lazim, right? So this one, for example, would be al-ana. So you count on your fingers 5 and then you join to the lam. This one here, khassa. And the last one, the lam and the mim. So the alif is just alif, but the lam and the mim are both lengthened, but do not neglect the nasal sound of the mim. So it's alif lam mim. Now, something interesting that we can actually extrapolate from here is this alif lam mim is pronounced as though it would be written. So alif, if you had to write alif out in Arabic letters, it would look like this here, alif. All right, so you've got alif, then you've got lam next to it, which is lam, and then you've got mim. So alif lam and mim. So you can see here, the reason why we pronounce this with the mud and this with the mud is because this lam is an open letter, right? This la is an open letter. And can you see we have two memes here that are here next to each other? Here's one meme, here's another meme. So a different way of writing two memes next to each other, one with the sakin, one with the haraka, is making one meme, but we put a tashdid on it, right? And now because you have an open letter, you have open letter la, that is joining to a tashdid, it is like the second case here of mad al-lazim. So you're going to have this mad extended to 5 alifs. And now this meme here, because it's essentially the end of a ayah, you're going to also lengthen it to 5 alifs, right? So that is actually the last category of mudud, which is mad arid, right? When you're stopping, any open letter at the end of a ayah should be lengthened to 5 alifs, either 5 or 3 or 1 alif, right? So it's preferred 5. But if you're reading at a tadweer pace, so there's 3 paces of recitation. Tartil, one is going to be tadweer and one is going to be hadar, right? So your tartil is going to be your slow paced recitation, like how you would read for when you're reading qiraat on a stage or something like that. Now, and your tadweer is more for your reading Quran in your salah or your day-to-day tilawa, and then your hadar is your tarawih pace. So if you're going to read in tartil, you lengthen this mid to 5 alifs, right? Otherwise, you lengthen it to 3 alifs for your day-to-day recitation. And if you're reading quickly in a tarawih setting, or if you're reading tilawah to somebody, then you can shorten it to 1 alif, right? But it's preferred first 5, then 3, then 1. So like we said, because this meme is effectively the ending of a ayah, we're going to lengthen it to 5 alifs. The final rule that we're discussing is qalqala. This means an echo or an explosion. So it's a combination of two sifat actually. When we did sifat lazima, we learned that there was hams and jahar, and there was shidda and rikhwa with baini in the middle. So if a letter doesn't have airflow to it, then it's a jahar letter, right? And the letters that are shidda are ajidu, qatin, bakata, right? So if you look at that mnemonic of shidda, you've got ajidu, so alif, jim, dal, qatin, qaf, ta, and bakata, right? So ba, kaf, and ta. Now this is all the shidda letters. Now of these letters, there are 2 of them that form part of the hums as well, right? So kaf and ta have hums. The rest of the letters are all shidda letters as well as letters of jahar, right? So that means they have no airflow and they are pronounced abruptly. Okay, so the combination of these two sifat, right, with the exception of alif, right? So the remaining letters that we have here, qaf, ta, ba, jim, and dal, these 5 letters, the combination of those two sifat, meaning no airflow plus quick pronunciation or abrupt pronunciation, these two things in combination result in the formation of the new sifat, which is called qalqala. Right, so what happens when you make qalqala, your tongue will go to the pronunciation of the letter and it will touch there abruptly and it will come immediately away, creating a bouncing or an echo. So the simplest way in which to explain a qalqala is to put a fatha on any of these letters and then reduce the fatha by 3, by a factor of 3. So it's 1/3 of a fatha. So what we can do is you put a alif before any of these letters and put a sakin on one of these letters, right? Now if I was to pronounce this ba with a fatha, it would be a ba, a ba. Now what I want you to do is take this ba and reduce the factor of that fatha by 3. So instead of a ba, you're going to say ab, ab. So you're going to let a little bit of sound flow out of the mouth. So you're going to touch the lips abruptly together, and immediately as they touch, you need to let go. Ab. So it creates that bounce. The same goes for all the other letters. So for a ta, it would be a ta. For a qaf, it would be a qa, ad, aj, and finally ba, ab. Okay, so you can practice with the fatha, dhamma, kasra before each of these. What's important to note is that a qalqala needs to be leaning towards a fatha always. It needs to be 1/3 of a fatha. It can never be 1/3 of a dhamma or 1/3 of a kasra, regardless of what letter is before it. This is very important because certain times you have a kasra before it or a ya afterwards or a dhamma before it, so it changes the tendency of that qalqala to lean towards a fatha. I'll give you an example in Surah Al-Shams. فقال لهم رسول الله ناقة الله وسقياها. Alright, 99% of Qurra pronounce this incorrectly because they say وسقياها, leaning towards a kasra because of the ya that comes after the qaf. The pronunciation of a kasra is very close to that pronunciation of the yas, the letter ya. So therefore, the qaf qalqala, it tends to come out a little bit less full than it's supposed to, and it comes out to leaning towards a kasra. So you need to be very careful to pronounce it in a manner that it is always leaning towards a fatha. وَالسُّقَيَاهَا وَالسُّقَيَاهَا, always leaning towards a fatha. And likewise, various other examples can be provided. For example, the word إطعام, right? It must lean towards a fatha. إطعام وجعلنا. Also, you will notice that this particular sifat is not part of sifat al-arida because it is permanent sifat. So it's part of sifat al-lazima, but it is one of those that doesn't have any opposite. Okay, so a lot of the sifat arida which don't have opposites, I haven't included any of them besides for qalqala because a lot of them are things that we already do and don't need further explanation. So if you mastered the makharij and the sifat arida, that those ones that are not mentioned in the video, it's not compulsory to learn them because you're already doing them. It's just good to know the rules so that you are aware of it. But I have incorporated those rules. I haven't given them a name, but during the makharij videos I may have mentioned one or two things about certain letters, so everything is incorporated therein. You don't need to worry about having missed anything, but this is the only sifa lazima that is mentioned that doesn't have an opposite.